Yeah, hi, my name is Ray Carlson. I'm an attorney. I've been practicing for over 35 years. And during that period of time, I spent a lot of time working on water law. In fact, I started with working on water law matters as soon as I started becoming an attorney back in the late 1980s. And I've studied the water rights on the various rivers in the San Joaquin Valley, including the Kings River. And I wrote this little presentation that's in the museum here on the Kings River. And there were limitations on the length of the presentation, so it was not really possible to go into the actual issues involving the water rights on the Kings River because those are very complicated. So what I did was I basically took sort of a geographical and a hydrological approach, and by that what I meant was I started by describing the Kings River, where it was, how it flows out of the mountains and down part of it down into the old Tulare Lake bottom, and then during the flood periods, how a lot of the water goes out to can ultimately go out to the Pacific Ocean by going north up through what's called the North Fork and joining the San Joaquin River. And then also explaining how the Tulare Lake bed also receives waters from the other rivers to the south, the Cahuilla, Tule, and Kern rivers, and how that happens. And when there's enough water in those rivers that can cause flooding in the Tulare Lake bottom. And we saw that flooding in 2023. In fact, the 2023 water year was actually the biggest year on the Kings River. It was over 4.5 million acre feet. An acre foot is enough water to cover an acre of land a foot deep in water. So that is a tremendous amount of water. And from the hydrology point of view, the flows in the Kings River, as with all the rivers that we have in this area, are highly variable both from year to year and within the year. And so from year to year, you can go from a record year like we had in 22-23 with 4.5 million acre feet to a year of like 350,000 acre feet that we had back in, I forget what it says here, 2014 to 2015. That was the driest year that we've had. So we can go from periods where there's so much water that a lot of land in the Tulare Lake bottom gets flooded to where there's so little water that the water doesn't run very long in the river to provide irrigation supplies. An important aspect of the river is the ability to divert water from the river to put it to reasonable beneficial use. And these efforts were started as early as the 1850s, but really got underway in the 1870s when the area became settled by hardworking farmers who banded together to form ditch companies like the People's Ditch Company and the Last Chance Water Ditch Company and others which are still in existence today. And they built the ditch systems that we have, and the ditch system typically would have a diversion point on the river that originally was built of brush and other and smaller and stones and things that could be put into the river to raise the level on the upstream side, so the water would flow from the river into a canal and then into the ditch system of the ditch company. And it still works that way today, except the diversion points are much more substantial. They have permanent weirs in the river, which can withstand fairly high flows in the river, whereas the old original brush, timber, brush, small stones, etc., that could be dams that could be built, they would oftentimes get washed away during the early part of the runoff period, what's known as the, quote, spring freshet, unquote, which is when you have a warm up in May, if you have a heavy snowfall up in the mountains, a lot of that water can melt fairly fast, and you basically have a large amount of water coming down the river in a relatively short period of time. And as everybody knows, if water gets enough force behind it, basically nothing can withstand it. And so it would wash these structures away, and they would then be rebuilt after the river went down, and then the diversions could begin. And it's also very important to understand that the original diversions were what is called run of the river. Run of the river means the diversion simply took the flows as they came and diverted them as long as they were available in sufficient quantities to reach their diversion works and into their canal systems. And so typically what would happen is you'd have the high flows in the early spring, say in May, and especially if you had a year like we often have where you have a temperature sort of peak around Memorial Day often, and you may get up to the high 90s and hundreds down in the valley, and that translates into temperatures in the 70s at the higher elevations. Well, that'll start melting the snowpack, and it comes down, and as I said, it would sometimes wash away the diversion structures, which would have to be rebuilt when the flows went down. But in any case, the run of the river meant you had to just simply accept the flows as the river ran. And so all the original water rights on the Kings River were established under run of the river conditions. And those are what are called pre-1914 rights, because they were developed before 1914, where all you had to do was post a notice and at the diversion point. Typically this was like a tree that was used, and then a notice would then be recorded in the county recorder's office to state that you were diverting X amount of water at a certain point for use on certain lands. And so that would be typically the point where the intake to the canal company's system was, and then the place of use would be the lands that were supplied by the ditches owned by the canal company. And so as you might imagine, there were a lot of people wanted to set up and establish their rights to the Kings River. This led to competing claims for the water, and ultimately there were the claims that were made. If you added them all up, they were more than the actual amount of water that was actually in the river, even in the higher flows. This led, of course, to conflict, and there are stories about people trying to interfere with the diversion works of other people so they couldn't divert water so that the people who were doing the interfering could divert water, and things of that nature. And so this led to a lot of litigation over water rights on the Kings River in the late 1800s and early 1900s in the counties of Fresno, Kings, and Tulare counties. So it was finally realized after several decades of litigation and conflict that this wasn't going to work. Litigation wouldn't work because the litigation would only bind the parties that were in the case. It wouldn't bind the people that weren't in the case. So, and there were no case that included everybody. So this led to cooler and wiser heads prevailing. And eventually in 1927, some key agreements were reached. One was called the Administrative Agreement, and the other was called the Water Right Indenture. And those agreements basically did two things. They formed the Kings River Water Association, which is in existence to this day, and there also was an agreement on how the flows were divided up in terms of what they called a flow schedule. So who got water and how much they got depended on how much was flowing in the river at a given time, and that's still in effect to this day. And so that original agreement in 1927 had 19 parties. Over the years, it's been added to, and now there are 29 parties. And each party that diverts water, they're called a unit. That's just their terminology. So there are now 29 units on the Kings River under these series of agreements, and when the agreements are all collected together in a book, they've been put into a small blue binder, and that's called the Kings River Blue Book. And so sometimes you can go to a water district meeting, and if water rights issues are raised, sometimes there is questions about whether something is or is not consistent with the Blue Book. And so in addition to some order starting to prevail, the other key development in the more modern times has been the construction of Pine Flat Dam and the reservoir behind it, which is a 1 million acre-foot reservoir, which is a large reservoir in our terms, and the reservoir was built it was built in the early 1950s. It was completed in 1954. And since that time, the Kings River has been regulated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So there are no more truly natural flows. There are regulated flows. So the river's been under what's called river regulation, which is distinct from the old run-of-the-river situation that I described earlier. And so the significance of that is that the original natural flows have to be calculated to determine how the schedule applies, to determine how the water that is released is diverted, and who gets it and how much and for how long. And typically the releases from the dam are controlled by the Corps of Engineers, and the quantity and timing of the releases is typically a result of coordination between the Kings River Water Association, which is the executive of which is called the Kings River Water Master. And so the Water Master and the Corps of Engineers coordinate on how much water is released from Pine Flat Dam at given times. So for an example, this year was not a flood year, So what they have agreed on is that certain flows would be released this year, beginning on June 1, and there will be a run of water. The water will run from June 1 through about August 15th, maybe a little bit later. And the various ditches will then divert the amount of water that they're entitled to. And so that's how it's done under river regulation. When floods occur, so to say, all bets are off, and what happens is the Corps will release what it calls flood releases from the reservoir, and they need to do this so that they have enough space in the reservoir to hold back anticipated flows that are coming down. This can happen if you have a very heavy snowpack, or you have very hot weather in a short span of time combined with a heavy snowpack. When you have a lot of this water, what I called earlier the spring freshet, well, instead of just crashing all the way down the river, it crashes down into the dam, and the dam has to be able to hold what comes down so you don't have water going over the top of the dam. That would be basically be a disaster. So the dam is operated to maintain enough storage space in the dam to contain these flows, which means that sometimes fairly large flows need to be released from the dam if there's not enough space in the dam because there's already a lot of water there. And so typically these flows, they try to keep them no higher than 6,000 cubic feet per second. And off to the side, a cubic foot per second is a measure of an amount of water, and it means a cubic foot of water passing a given point. It means how many cubic feet of water are passing a given point each second. And a reference point is if you have 1 cubic foot per second flowing for 24 hours, that equals 2 acre feet. So if you're releasing 6,000 cubic feet per second from the dam, that's 12,000 acre feet a day. That's enough for about 50,000 people for a year. So we've had flood releases which have lasted from May all the way into July, and they typically go down the North Fork where they can go to the Pacific Ocean. And if you go to where the McMullen grade goes over the North Fork, you can actually see this. And you can just see what to us in this area where we don't have a lot of water is a tremendous amount of water coming down and crashing through there. You just think of how much water that could be used if it could be saved somehow, it could be used for irrigation or for supplying towns and cities, but we don't have the ability to do that at present. There are some areas like the northeast Kings County, where Kings County Water District is, where they have about 1,000 acres of basins where they can put water into those basins, and it percolates into the ground and joins the groundwater. The purpose of that is to help replenish the groundwater so it doesn't get exhausted. But we would need many, many, many more such basins to make a big dent on some of those really big flows that come down in the flood periods. And ultimately, of course, when the flows are big enough, there's no way to take all of them, no matter how many basins you had, because once you get the water into a basin, it takes a certain amount of time before it sinks into the ground. And even if they're always trying to locate those basins where the conditions for sinking into the ground are good, where there's a lot of sand and so forth. But even so, it still takes some time once that basin gets full for that water to percolate down. So if just from the course of what I discussed, when I discussed the hydrology, you can see that there are a tremendous number of competing factors involved in diverting and putting the water to use. And I didn't, as I said, was not able, within the scope of the space that we had available or the time that we have available, to get into the issue of water rights. I only just kind of touched on them in terms of the relationship between run-of-the-river rights and regulated flows. So that's pretty much what I've got that I can, as far as what I had presented here in the exhibit.